BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello and welcome to Rarer, the show that takes you closer to nature and deep inside the biggest issues facing our planet.
I'm environment journalist Tom Heap.
And I'm physicist Helen Czerski. And this week we are looking at an amazing substance that's left us with a big problem. It's in your frying pan and your waterproof coat, your carpets and your sofa.
But it's also in your fruit bowl, the bread you're buttering for your lunch, and the bag your loaf came in.
And it's in your blood and the water you and we drink.
This family of chemicals has been associated with decreased fertility, immune system issues, and increased risk of some cancers. And it's absolutely everywhere, including in me.
So today we're going to help you understand these chemicals, ask just how worried we should all be, and look at the alternatives. And one of them involves some help from a friendly polar bear.
To help us out, we're joined by Stephanie Metzger from the Royal Society of Chemistry, Hannah Evans from the environmental charity Fidra, and by one of my biggest environmental heroes, American attorney Robert Bilott. What we're talking about today are PFAS, that's per- and polyfluoralkyl substances, a group of around 10,000 synthetic chemicals.
So this is a difficult one, isn't it, Tom? Because when you start to look at the list of the places you find PFAS, it is very personal. You know, I had a look at the list that's on the UK government's drinking water inspectorate earlier, and, you know, it's skin creams and floor polish and rinse aid for dishwashers, and I had to think about where it might be in my life, and the places I got to were probably, I'm not a big cosmetics person, but outdoor clothes and baking pans.
And also foods. I mean, things like strawberries, tomatoes, cream and things like that. And one of the things that I hope will help the audience with a little bit is kind of where these sit on their worriedometer, if you see what I mean. Because I think it's very difficult to be categorical about this, because we know they are damaging, we know they are a threat, but at what level, how much, etc., how to avoid, are there alternatives, all these kind of things makes it very difficult to be categorical about, if you like, how worried should we be, which is a perfectly reasonable question for people to ask.
So Stephanie, let's get started with the very basic chemistry here. What are these things? What are they made from? What do they do?
As Tom mentioned, it's a group of over 10,000 chemicals, but they all share a basic backbone of carbon atoms bonded with fluorine. And they can be small or large molecules, they can be individual molecules, or they can be polymers, which is when you take one individual molecule and you repeat it over time to make a big chain. This carbon-fluorine bond is one of the strongest bonds in nature, and it's really hard to break it apart.
Sorry, you say in nature. Do these ever naturally occur, or are they basically entirely created by us?
So PFAS are man-made. It's a very stable bond, and it's really hard to break apart. It takes a lot of energy to break it down. That means that these molecules are really durable. It means that they are really resistant to other effects, so heat, for example. And also they have a lot of other properties like oil resistance, stain resistance, waterproofness, water resistance. They are slippery. And of course, like I said before, they're durable and long-lasting, both in terms of holding up to stuff, but also in terms of they last for a long time.
Hence the moniker Forever Chemicals, which are often applied to these. But let's just, rather than going future, let's look back. How and when were they discovered or made?
PFAS were first discovered in the 1930s in Germany, and at a similar time, some scientists in the US were also doing similar types of chemistry and came up with a similar type of molecule. So again, there's many PFAS, and even at the beginning, people were coming up with slightly different versions.
And what were they doing with it? What were they trying to invent when they first made this?
So I think when it was originally discovered, they did it by accident, but they realized that it had these properties like this slipperiness and this durability. And they thought, this could be really useful. So, for example, in the Manhattan Project in the United States,
the creation of the atomic bomb.
Exactly. Yeah. They used it for some of the processes, for some of the machinery that they used to hold the really highly radioactive or really caustic substances that they were using in that process. And of course, they found it worked really well because, again, it's highly durable and resistant, these materials. So that was in the 40s. And DuPont actually commercialized Teflon in the 1940s. But by the 50s, everybody realized it was so useful, and it was being used in a lot of industrial processes, but also widely in consumer products.
This is where it came into frying pans
Exactly.
and other cookware.
Exactly. So in the 50s, a French company called Tefal thought, oh, this would be really convenient if I had a pan that nothing stuck to it. And as with many things in the 1950s, there were all these new labor-saving devices. So a non-stick pan seemed like a no-brainer.
And how about the space industry and applications in space? Because that's often talked about in this context.
It's used, again, for a lot of different purposes based on the properties. So heat resistance, there's a lot of UV and heat in space, but also to protect the electronic equipment, to make sure that it was not exposed to the elements. So yeah, lots of different applications, and that persists to today in our airplanes and our space shuttles.
Well, when you hear them described like that, they do sound pretty amazing, and that's how they were seen, a minor boon for modern life, until there were some troublesome signs of medical issues associated with them that started to be revealed around the DuPont factory that was making PFAS chemicals in West Virginia. Lawyer Robert Bilott took up the case, and his story was dramatised in the film Dark Waters.
They should say what they done.
You're right, they should. And it kills me that they won't. But that would mean going to trial and proving that C8 killed your cows. And every scientist who knows anything about any of this already works for these chemical companies. That's not an accident, Earl. Earl, these companies, they have all the money all the time, and they'll use it, trust me. I know, I was one of them.
You're still one of them.
Well, Robert was played in the film by Mark Ruffalo, who's a really active campaigner on water quality issues, grew up near the Great Lakes, was concerned about poisoned fish and things like that. And I had a chance to talk to him about the inspiration behind the film when it came out in 2019.
What struck me as compelling and film-worthy was the fact that Rob Bilott was actually a defense attorney who would normally be defending huge chemical companies. And by chance, a farmer that his grandmother knew, his cows were being poisoned by DuPont, a landfill. And this takes him down a whole other journey of sacrifice and loss, hardship and difficulties. He's the kind of hero that is a hero because you don't want to be him.
It's the ultimate sort of gamekeeper turned poacher story in this case.
Yes, and that swimming upstream in that system, which is a whole system that's 100 years old in America, that has allowed all this shit to happen, all of this poison to be on the market, all of these regulations to be gamed so that major corporations could put this kind of thing into the environment without having to have any kind of responsibility for it. The fact that it was him was the only way it could happen.
Well, that's a lot of talking about someone. We've actually got someone joining us now. That is Rob Bilott, the lawyer who was played by Mark Ruffalo and who Mark was just talking about there. Robert, how did you first hear about this problem?
Well, gosh, it was almost 26 years ago. My phone rings in my office, and this gentleman on the other end of the line starts rattling off how he's got cows dying on his property, and I needed to help him, and he started raising his voice, and frankly, I had no idea who this guy was and why he was calling me. At the time, I was working for a lot of big chemical companies, and I was really oftentimes defending against people like this gentleman calling me, saying there was pollution on his property. But I was about to hang up the phone when he blurted out, your grandmother said you'd help me. And so I paid a little closer attention and found out that he was calling me from Parkersburg, West Virginia, which is where my grandmother and my mother had grown up. And so I paid a little closer attention, and he explained and told me a story about cows that were getting sick on his property that led to what became litigation spanning the next several decades.
What was the harm and what was the solution, or in inverted commas, that came out at the other end?
Well, what we ultimately found out was the cows on Mr. Tennant's property were drinking white foam contaminated with a massive amount of a chemical that the DuPont company was using to make Teflon, a chemical we now call PFOA, perfluorooctanoic acid, one of these forever chemicals, a chemical that they had been using for decades and had gone essentially unregulated in the U.S. until we started really digging in and finding out that this chemical existed and was getting out not just into the water these cows were drinking, but likely all over the planet.
And you won the case?
Yeah, it took some time, but we eventually pieced together the story of what was going on there with this chemical being used by DuPont. We were able to settle the case for Mr. Tennant, the farmer in West Virginia, and his family. But what we had found out was this stuff was impacting the entire surrounding community. So it led to another case, a big class action lawsuit on behalf of tens of thousands of people in that community, which went on for several more years. Which then led to more litigation for the people who've had cancers from this material, and has led to what is now thousands of cases in the United States and across the planet dealing with this chemical and these closely related chemicals in the same family.
So this hasn't ever really stopped for you since that phone call 26 years ago. But what's the sort of overview of the current status? I mean, when you started all of this, it must really have felt like a David versus Goliath situation. What's the status of this fight now for you?
So it took us a long time to convince regulators, lawmakers, scientists that this stuff really exists. It was bad, and it was as widespread as it was. And now that story has finally made its way out to the public, to the scientific community, to lawmakers, through things like the film Dark Waters or documentaries and other stories that have finally reached the rest of the world, we are now seeing the laws change. We are seeing countries all over the planet now taking steps to try to address and limit and restrict these chemicals. And not only are those laws changing, the companies making and using these are starting to phase them out, and they're starting to take them out of products. And finally, consumers are becoming aware and at least being able to start taking steps to protect themselves for the first time.
Slight steps aside, but it seems really important in that the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, is currently the target of the Trump administration. I think they would say that people are being laid off. You know, there's this move in America to deregulate and to not make such a fuss about pollution. How do you see that affecting this fight? I'm
hoping that as this story has finally made its way out and the science has become clear, we've got pretty well uniform bipartisan support now in the country that this is a public health problem. There are some concerns at the EPA about doing things differently with climate change or oil and gas, but hopefully clean water and chemical poisoning of the population is still going to be a priority for our EPA. We can only hope.
Just to come to the question I proposed at the beginning, how would you answer the how worried should we be as a general population, as opposed to a community who's living right next to some pretty intense emissions?
Well, unfortunately, these are troubling contaminants. And the one reason why I've been as vocal as I've been and as active as I've been for as long as I've been about these is because these are incredibly unique materials and they are so widespread. And the concern is, as you mentioned earlier, they're in our air, they're in our water, they're in the soil, they're in the food we eat, they're in products we're exposed to. They're in our blood, almost every person on the planet. And the concerning part of that is what the science has shown us is their ability to cause harm occurs at very low exposure levels, at levels that frankly are being found in the general population, not just highly exposed groups. That's why you see agencies like what's happening in the United States setting such incredibly low exposure levels. It's because these chemicals can create havoc at a very low exposure. So that's why, frankly, I think it is a global public health concern.
Well, talking about global, you've got another film coming out, which I gather focuses on a place called Wreck Bay in Australia.
Yeah, there's a new documentary with Mark Ruffalo again appearing as well, where we try to tell the story of what the 3M company has known about these chemicals and covered up, frankly, for decades. You know, what you see in Dark Waters or the documentary The Devil We Know really focused on what DuPont knew and what they covered up. But you have to keep in mind, the company that created the chemical DuPont was using was the 3M company in Minnesota. And so what you see in this new film, How to Poison a Planet, is really what 3M also knew for decades, and how what they did led to this material getting out all over the world, including that community in Australia you mentioned.
Thank you very much indeed to lawyer and clearly advocate Robert Bilott.
This is Rare Earth from BBC Radio 4 and BBC Sounds, and today we are investigating the family of novel chemicals that, with pretty incredible speed, has found its way into our lives, our bodies and our environment. And that's PFAS, per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances. With us are Stephanie Metzger of the Royal Society of Chemistry and Hannah Evans from the environmental campaigning charity Fidra. So Stephanie, let's just get into the chemistry a bit of why it is these things cause a problem.
As Robert alluded to, some of these chemicals have been shown to be associated with cancers, but some have been shown to interfere with other processes in our bodies. For example, our immune response to vaccines. Others get into our cells and interfere with our proteins and the biological processes that those do in our bodies. So it can depend on each type of PFAS may affect us in a different way, but they do accumulate over time, and that buildup can cause interference to our biological processes.
Hannah, how do we come into contact with these substances? Where are the places that really matter when it comes to potential harm?
Well, I think as Robert mentioned earlier, these chemicals are quite literally everywhere. They're in the water that we drink, the food that we're consuming, they're in the products that we use every day. And this is what makes it really difficult in terms of consumers' choice to try and avoid exposure to these chemicals, because they're in so many of our everyday items, and the information about where they're located isn't always available. But
do we know whether they're equally harmful? I mean, if you have a pan, or you have, you hear that there might be PFAS in the water, or you have some shoes that are coated with something to make them water resistant. Are some of those potential contact routes more harmful than others?
Well, yes, it's a really good question, because it's something that we're learning more about. There was research that came out of last year of trying to explain how we'd misinterpreted the extent of absorption, so how PFAS can penetrate through the skin barrier. So this was showing that basically through dermal contact we can be more exposed to PFAS than we previously thought. In terms of what's the most hazardous route, I don't think we have a particular answer to that. But as mentioned earlier, it's this compounding, consistent and ongoing exposure that means that we're able to build up these levels of PFAS in our bodies.
So there is this saying, the dose is the poison, which is that, our bodies can cope with some things in quite small quantities, and it's the amount that matters. So are there safe limits for this? How does all of that work? And obviously recognising that this is a class of thousands of chemicals, and therefore it's hard to say exactly what's safe.
You're spot on there, because we do have levels for some individual PFAS, but there's many that most of them we don't know about. For example, the European Food Standards Agency has given a guideline amount of how much PFAS you can consume per week per kilogram of body weight. So there are some limits. So the European one gives a guideline for 4 kinds of PFAS. Obviously, that's 4 out of 10,000 or more. So we've still got a really big knowledge gap there. So in the UK, for example, in our drinking water, we have individual standards for each kind of PFAS of a list of 48 different kinds. Each of those must be under 100 nanograms per litre. But actually, the Drinking Water Inspectorate for England and Wales also introduced a cumulative limit starting just this January, actually, so just a couple months ago, where the full total of all of those 48 also must not exceed 100 nanograms per litre.
And just on that, is there regular testing of our water supply
Yes.
to make sure it stays beneath that? So they've set a level, and can we be fairly confident that the water we drink stays below it?
Yes.
But this dose stuff that Helen mentioned is really important, because as I hinted at earlier, I was tested for this, because it was in a programme, Countryfile, that you were involved in as well, where they tested various foods that I'd eaten and also then tested my blood. And it would have been actually pretty extraordinary if it wasn't.
Exactly.
But it leaves me and I guess listeners with the question, okay, it's there, but how much of a risk is that? And I guess that's almost impossible to say.
That's the thing is with, for example, the chemicals that were in the Dark Waters case, there has been some studies now that have tracked people over time to see what the effects have been over time. And that community, unfortunately, was a really good place to study because that community had been exposed at high levels over a long
presumably
time.
Thousands of times higher than what
exactly.
I thought.
So for any of us individually, it is hard to guess. So those limits that are set for our drinking water or for food are estimates of what would be a safe level if we consumed that over time.
So Tom, you were, as you said, you were actually tested for this, so you know you've got it in you. And what was your reaction to getting those numbers back? I mean, are you high? You know, where are you on the scale of PFAS exposure?
I wasn't particularly high, and I'm not a particularly nervous person. So it didn't make me think, oh my God, I've got limited time to live. I really must write that will and tell everybody I love them. Although that is, of course, true. So it didn't affect me that way. But it did just illustrate how pervasive they are, as we've said, and therefore kind of raise this question about what is the real level of threat from that, which I think, as we've established, is a very, very difficult question to answer.
It's almost like a ghost. It's kind of shifting with time. So I found a paper from some colleagues of mine who actually do what I do. They study breaking waves and bubbles, but they study the little tiny drops of water that get spat into the air as bubbles burst, which we call aerosolization. And so they were just studying this in the ocean, and they found that if you had a little bit of PFAS in the ocean water, the amount that was spat out of the bubbles was really very, very high.
Even something as benign as ocean spray has got this.
Even those nice little bubbles.
Exactly. I mean, this is why polar bears have PFAS in them. Polar bears aren't living near factories, but yet.
Well, we're going to talk about a case study a little bit closer to home now, because joining us is journalist Leana Hosea of Watershed Investigations. And Leana, you've been covering the extent of PFAS pollution in the UK for several years now for Costing the Earth, the programme that came before this on Radio 4 of the Environment, and also for The Guardian.
Yes, we do deep dive environmental investigations for the mainstream media, and we've done a lot of work on forever chemicals, mapping contamination, looking at the costs of cleanup, and industry's lobbying efforts to prevent legislation.
So we've heard this stuff is pretty much everywhere, but presumably that it's not everywhere evenly. Some places are worse than others. So are there particular hotspots in the UK that we should be particularly worried about?
Well, an Environment Agency report identified more than 10,000 high-risk sites contaminated with PFAS. And some of those hotspots of contamination will include manufacturers and industrial users of PFAS, landfills, sewage outfalls, sewage sludge, and firefighting foams is also a major source of forever chemical contamination. So that will include places like airports, Heathrow, RAF bases, where there's a lot of fire training taking place. So the question is, how much this could be polluting our drinking water supplies.
But it's a town in North Yorkshire that you've been specifically looking at for us?
Yes, that's the town of Bentham. Now, Angus Fire International Safety Group, known locally as Angus Fire, has been manufacturing and testing firefighting foams containing PFAS at that site from the 1970s until last year. Now, the firm says it's made good progress with its PFAS containment and it's working to address contamination according to Environment Agency performance limits. But we can reveal that a recent report for the Environment Agency says more needs to be done to monitor the spread of pollution.
Bentham.
I've just walked out of Bentham train station and right in front of me is Angus Fire's factory. It's a small town and the factory is right at the heart of it. Hi Max, good to meet you. It's really pretty here, isn't it?
It's gorgeous, isn't it? It's absolutely stunning. I love it. And if you can block everything else out, all the silent sort of chemicals and stuff like that, it's absolutely gorgeous. Welcome to Bentham. You all right, Fraggle?
I'm meeting local resident Matt Young, the chair of Cleaner Bentham, a community group which formed after finding out they have the highest levels of forever chemicals detected in groundwater to date in the UK from firefighting foams produced here. The town is on public water, which isn't drawn from the groundwater, but the land and River Wenning has also been contaminated and the group is exploring legal action over possible health effects.
There is a lot of worry about talking out. I'm not afraid to speak up. I think that when something wrong's going on, you have to.
Matt has taken me on what he calls his toxic tour around Bentham. Okay, this is Duke Street. So tell me about Duke Street.
Is the area where Angus have been buying houses from people because of the pollution that has seeped from their site. So where we see now, this lane was full of foam.
Angus Fire would practice with their foam there?
That's correct, yes. And the lagoons never used to be covered over either. So when the rainwater came down, obviously the lagoon rose over into the surrounding areas. If we have a look, here's the lagoons.
Just here on the left of the lane are Angus Fire's lagoons, and you can see right through because it's just a little small wire fence and the lagoons are quite low-lying. I can see the pipe coming out from the factory.
It was something like 2 million litres of water they had in here. Plus they had issues with the liner where the liner was bubbling and torn. So, if you're not taking care of the actual protection between the lagoon water and the aquifer and soil on top, you are going to get problems. The field opposite used to be allotments as well, and these used to flood with the foams. So you've got at least a generation of people that have been eating...
because obviously vegetables do absorb PFAS as well.
Absolutely. And I think for 6-12 months we need to stop, find out how bad the situation is.
So you want a proper investigation by the authorities to find out how far the pollution has spread. I mean, I guess Angus Fire would say, well, we're not producing the PFAS firefighting foams anymore.
I don't think the point is whether they're producing them anymore, it's whether they dealt with the PFAS responsibly in the past.
Because obviously these are called forever chemicals because they hang around pretty much forever. They don't break down naturally in the environment. So whatever Angus Fire has been making since the 70s and spilling here would still be here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, definitely.
And the factory, backs right onto these people's houses here on Duke Street, including Richard's, who I'm going to go and see now. Hi, Richard. Hi. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks. Yeah, you all right?
Richard Naylor, his wife and 2 kids moved from Leeds to Bentham in 2021, one of many to move to the countryside during lockdown, seeking a better quality of life.
We found this amazing house that we now live in, which ideally was meant to be our kind of forever home. It's now become our forever chemicals home. Obviously, we knew there was a factory next to us when we moved, but what wasn't evident was that there had been the leakage of PFAS chemicals in the land around our house, some of which probably is historical, but it certainly also happened since we moved, that there has been leakage from the lagoons. It is a bit like having a gun against your head to move house.
Homeowners on this street have a separate legal action against Angus Fire over the devaluation of their properties from the pollution.
We first found out about this in September when Angus Fire called us all in down this road to tell us that the land had chemicals in it. It's been 6 months and we're no further down the road to resolving our future. Angus Fire, they've tried to do the best by their bottom line, but I don't necessarily think they're doing best by the community. There's gardens out the back which they were growing vegetables in, and I know that some people have lived here for a long time eating those vegetables. So we've been here a shorter period. It's not as applicable to us, but for them it definitely is.
How is the community overall taking it?
It's quite mixed. I think a lot of people put Angus Fire on a pedestal because they bring employment to the community. It's divided people.
John Hughes worked for Angus Fire as a development chemist from 2013 to 2017 when he was employed to formulate a new PFAS foam for the company after a toxic forever chemical was banned. He also claims Angus Fire did not provide adequate PPE to keep their workers safe.
You could smell the solvents that were contained within the fluorosurfactant formulations.
So the PFAS was in the solvent, you could smell the solvent, and therefore it was very likely that you were also breathing in PFAS too.
You could reasonably assume. I was using lab coat, goggles, gloves, which is standard lab PPE. Whilst on the test site, we weren't using any other PPE other than the fire tunics, gloves and helmet and boots.
And that was not sufficient?
No, because you would get a lot of dermal contact with foam, and also there would be aerosolization because of the fire testing, because of the extreme heat and combustion involved.
How was it like on the factory floor?
They'd be wearing gloves, but they would only be wearing overalls, and then they would wear the same overalls every day. They wore sufficient PPE for what they were doing in terms of manual handling, but none of it was relevant to the blending of fluorosurfactants. They'd be exposed to much greater quantities. I think there should have been far stricter hygiene protocols in order to be doing what we were doing.
Did you ever bring up any issues?
There is a lot of social capital to the company. I got the feeling that if I raised any issues, that I would not be looked upon well.
According to Angus Fire, PPE was provided to all foam employees, along with washrooms and showers. And safety protocols were also followed on site for all chemicals in accordance with information and material safety data sheets provided by the manufacturer of the chemical.
And you've got this really gorgeous, fast-running little beck. It's full of crystal clear water, and then it's got all those horrible little chemicals in it.
I'm back with Matt again, who's taking me across the field from the factory to the River Wenning, where high levels of PFAS were discharged. So how does that make you feel when you look at the river and you think, oh, you wouldn't want your kids to be paddling in that in the summer?
I wouldn't want my pets to be in it, to be honest. Yeah, I mean, it's a shame. It's such a gorgeous area. This is the waste treatment waterworks. This is where we know Angus have been dumping effluent, so the wastewater from the ponds, from the lagoons.
Documents show that the factory had a permit to send their chemical waste effluent from the lagoons to the wastewater treatment plant run by United Utilities, which discharged it into the river, as well as turning it into fertiliser for farms. In a statement, United Utilities said,
"Sludge from Bentham Wastewater Treatment Works is treated to the highest standards before being recycled to land. However, wastewater treatment processes are not designed to remove PFAS, and there are currently no permit standards for PFAS in treated wastewater. The volume of sludge used from Bentham was very low and estimated to be approximately around 0.002% of the throughput from the Bioresource Centre where it's treated."
We found out that there are a lot of issues that have been going on for a very long time. This regime at Angus haven't done what they should have been doing to keep us safe. It's no wonder we have an issue like we have, to be honest.
Thanks, Leana. Well, we asked Angus Fire about the situation in Bentham, and they gave us this statement.
Angus Fire is proud of the work it does in designing and manufacturing products that save lives and protect critical assets around the world. We recognise the concerns about potentially damaging environmental impacts from historic operations at our facility, and regret the inconvenience and worry that this has caused in Bentham. Angus Fire is engaged, and has been for several years, in a comprehensive testing programme being conducted by independent and industry-leading environmental consultants that's intended to establish the extent of PFAS contamination at our site and surrounding area. We will continue to work with our regulator, the Environment Agency, in determining what corrective action and remediation is required and where. Angus has also made good progress with its PFAS site containment activities, with the recent installation of a stormwater processing plant to meet the stringent performance limits agreed with the Environment Agency.
Leana, you said, or someone referred to this as a bit of a sort of company town. What kind of, did you get any kind of reaction, any sort of static from being there, any pushback?
There was some pushback. In fact, quite a lot of my interviewees dropped out, saying that they didn't want to speak out, they didn't want to bite the hand that feeds them. And I came to understand that personally, because I met a very prominent local businessman who just sort of came after me a bit and shouted at me, trying to get me to hand over my recording, because he was annoyed that I was there reporting on the pollution.
So where are we with the regulation of these chemicals? As I understand it, there's a universal ban being proposed in the European Union?
That being proposed in the EU would be a universal. That's all but essential uses of PFAS would be covered under that restriction.
So that's the EU, but how about specific countries? I think the French have got a partial ban, right?
Yes, so we're seeing this happen with member states across the EU. So yes, there's the French ban that's been publicised recently, and there's also action happening in Denmark. So Denmark has similarly put together, they've put together a national action plan for PFAS. So this restricts PFAS in certain uses, so clothing and footwear, but it also sets out funding for remediation, further research, and then innovation into PFAS-free alternatives.
But it's not universal. I mean, even in France, the company Tefal is French, and it's kind of noticeable that the cookware is exempted from this ban, which seems quite convenient if what you do is make a load of cookware.
Oh, absolutely. So to clarify, the French restriction and the action happening in Denmark is absolutely not universal, of course. It's sector-specific, as you mentioned. And I would just highlight that a really key point for the Denmark and the French restrictions is that they are set in the context of a universal restriction on the horizon. So their plan is to introduce these restrictions to try and reduce emissions as soon as possible. These will then be superseded once a universal PFAS restriction enters into force. And this is something that the UK could be looking at as well.
Are any specifically banned?
So there are 3 specifically banned in the UK based on the Stockholm Convention, which is an international treaty on persistent organic pollutants. So that's PFAS and PFOA, and then one other one, PFHXS. But they will be moving forward with a ban on PFAS in firefighting foams. So that's obviously really interesting based on what we just heard from Leana. But of course, that's only one type of use. So it doesn't impact consumer products like the French and Danish bans do, or restrictions do, I should say. And it doesn't impact industrial use.
It seems clear that given the choice, you would not have them around. So why are they still being made? Like, what is the incentives driving these companies to keep making these things, even though, I mean, as we've heard in America, they might be saving up enormous lawsuits for themselves?
They are very useful. I mean, we've talked about this the whole time in the podcast about how there are so many uses in industry and consumer products, in industrial uses and high-tech uses. There are a lot of very specific processes that either have been tailored to using a PFAS, or PFAS are used because they're really, really reliable. And it would take a lot of effort, to be honest, to probably move away from those processes. Whether that is in terms of like retooling your factory or reformulating your products, that's difficult. But also in some cases, there are areas where PFAS has been the most effective material.
Well, let's hear what the UK Chemical Industries Association had to say on the thoughts of a proposed ban, and they told us there are critical applications of PFAS in healthcare, examples being lubrication of oxygen-carrying devices and drugs for cancer treatment. Transitioning away from the use of PFAS in such an application therefore needs consideration before doing so. PFAS are used in industrial equipment, seals and gaskets, etc., to ensure their safe operation, and it is critical that any alternative must do the same.
And then they go on to say, irrespective of regulation, many companies are actively working to generate alternative solutions. This requires all parts of society needing to have confidence in the safety and environmental impact of alternatives to PFAS. And so it's very striking to me, Tom, that, especially the part of the statement that you read out, they're picking critical applications of PFAS in healthcare. I reckon that is a tiny proportion of all the places that PFAS is used.
A common argument that's raised around taking a group-based restriction to PFAS is those essential uses. And I think it's important to point out that we do have a precautionary principle that's enshrined into our Environment Act in the UK. And this supports us using principles or concepts such as the essential use concept. So where there are applications of PFAS where there are no suitable alternatives currently known, and where their use is deemed essential to society, that's where derogations and transitionary periods can come in. But otherwise, there is no that in, and I think it was commented earlier, this only accounts for a handful or a small proportion of PFAS uses. But where we look at the majority of them, for example, when we talk about food packaging, clothing, cosmetics, cleaning products, where there are already widely available alternatives, this should not be a reason not to take action in the UK.
We've mentioned a few times consumer products and how they're in a lot of things we use, and we're going to look at some of the alternatives that might be around now.
Yeah, so there's no suggestion that things like a properly used PFAS-coated frying pan or waterproof coat is going to make you ill. But given that, there's all this talk of leaks from production facilities and how persistent these chemicals are in the environment, you might feel that you want to avoid them. So Hannah Evans from Fidra, what are the alternatives if you do want to avoid them?
So this is a really good question, and we get a lot of inquiries about PFAS-free alternatives. So the alternatives is very sector specific, but it could be, for example, just a different chemistry that's being used with the product. So, for example, there are numerous cosmetics and cleaning products that are PFAS free. That's not necessarily because they've replaced PFAS, but just because they were inherently already PFAS free, using different chemical mixtures that achieve the same output.
And so is that something you might find on the label? I mean, how do you know?
So this is the point to come to, is that unfortunately this information is not widely accessible, to the general public. So there is no requirement to label PFAS in products, and it's incredibly difficult therefore to identify where they are and whether there is a PFAS-free alternative. So this brings it on to the point that this really isn't a responsibility that should have to be put onto the consumer to choose a PFAS-free alternative. We should be able to trust that the products are safe and free from persistent and toxic chemicals. And it's the same when we think about things like food packaging. If we're given a pastry in a paper bag, we're not given the option of a PFAS-free or a PFAS-containing paper bag. We don't have that freedom of choice, unfortunately. So that's why we have the ultimate need for regulation.
Helen, you've got a really interesting thing that they've been working on at University College London, your place.
Oh, yeah. Well, so some of my colleagues who study anti-icing, actually, so that's one of the things that PFAS is used for.
On planes, you mean?
On planes,
de-icing,
yes, that de-icing. Well, there's lots of places where you don't want ice, but one of the animals that really doesn't want ice is a polar bear. And I guess I'd never really thought about this, but they're in and out of water. If I put a weather station somewhere like that, it would just be covered in icicles and rime.
That's a really good point. You mean when they come out of the water, why they don't immediately turn into a big frosty ball?
Yeah, or if they're sitting on the side, why don't they just get ice blown all over them and they become a solid icicle? So a scientist who works on this went, oh, that's a bit weird. I wonder what it is that's in polar bear fur that is doing this job. And so they had a look and they found that it's the sebum, which is the sort of hair grease that polar bears have. And it's got these lipids in it, these fats that are very specifically anti-icing. The ice just slides off them. And they actually did a comparison between the polar bear hair grease and a PFAS product that had actually been discontinued that came on skis. And they found that they were about equivalent. So what is naturally on the polar bears is just as good, basically, as these industrially used chemicals. What they were saying was that, well, look, if a polar bear can make this, then maybe so can we.
An opportunity for chemists, Stephanie?
Absolutely. It is an opportunity for chemists and researchers to take advantage of what will be a new market for new products and new materials that can provide the same benefits as PFAS, but in a way that is not as harmful to us or to the environment.
We discussed earlier that these things bioaccumulate, which means they build up in our bodies, but there are apparently a few ways to get rid of them. And Leana, there's this suggestion that people might seriously have bloodletting done. Is this a serious suggestion?
Yes, it sounds Victorian, but it is a serious suggestion by scientists. So what happened on the island of Jersey is that there was an aquifer near the airport, and the firefighting foam polluted it, and some people have been drinking from it. And the government ran some blood tests of those residents in that area and found that they had elevated levels in their blood, which were above sort of US average population levels. And this independent science panel has recommended that they could undergo bloodletting if they want to bring those levels in their blood down.
So we should definitely emphasise that this is not something to try at home.
But the notion there is that you drain some of the blood, let's say 15% of it, and when it gets replaced,
yes,
it gets replaced with less PFAS in it. Is that the sort of idea?
Yes. So, the contaminated blood will be let out with a needle in your arm, and then you will produce fresh blood. You're going to have to do this process for quite some time, so it is quite costly.
Sort of flushing almost, isn't it?
Yeah.
One of the things we've heard that there are some filtration technologies and things to get rid of these or reduce these dramatically in water and things like that, but it still leaves you with the PFAS themselves in whatever filter that you've used.
Exactly.
Stephanie, just briefly, I think there are ways that chemists are coming up with to actually break that really strong bond you referred to at the start and actually make them pretty much totally safe.
The most commonly used way at the moment is incineration, We know this is reliable if we essentially burn the PFAS at a hot enough temperature that it breaks them down. However, I'm talking about over 1,000 degrees Celsius.
So this is not a normal, your council incinerator, whatever.
Exactly, and that's the issue. So in the UK, there's only about 3 or 4 high temperature incinerators. In the rest of Europe, there's similarly low capacity. And incinerating them at that temperature will fully mineralize or break down the PFAS into safe components. But if we do it instead in these municipal waste incinerators, which burn at a much lower temperature, we actually risk just transforming the PFAS into other kinds of PFAS that often are then released, for example, through the smokestack and get in the air.
The Royal Society of Chemistry did put out a report relatively recently that had a huge list of, chemists are really trying on this one, right?
So there are other ways. So, for example, some methods that are being investigated include things like sonolysis, which is using sound waves to break down molecules. Another one is called electrochemical oxidation, which essentially is zapping them with an electric current. There's a lot of R&D going on into other methods for destroying these PFAS, and especially in a way that isn't as energy intensive as incineration.
So there's something here, Leana, about the difference between removing or destroying PFAS when you've got, a load of PFAS in a bucket and it's definitely in a small bucket and you can look at it and deal with it, and PFAS that's just spread through the soil or the water. What's the situation when it comes to cleaning up the wider environment?
It's incredibly complex, which is why the cost of remediation is incredibly high. We found that if we don't do anything, the cost could reach £1.6 trillion across the UK and Europe over a 20-year period.
Those are kind of health costs, are they?
No, that's not even health costs. That's just decontamination costs of only PFOS and PFOA. So, because when it comes to remediating contaminated soils, for example, there's a remediation project in Antwerp where they're actually having to wash hundreds of tons of soil, and then you have to, got the PFAS in the water, and then you have to deal with that contaminated water there.
So it's easier to deal with contaminated water than it is to deal with contaminated soil. The way you deal with the soil is wash it into the water and then deal with the water.
Yeah, potentially, because then you can run the water through a filtration system. But of course, you have to have proper filtration systems, and you have to upgrade so many wastewater treatment plants to deal with it.
So Stephanie, is the problem here that we don't really know well enough how to destroy PFAS, or is it that it's just so expensive to do it that no one is really going to try?
It's a bit of both. So first, as Leana said, you have to concentrate the PFAS. And as you said, right, it's easier when it's in a bucket than when it's spread out. So we can concentrate the PFAS, for example, by filtering it in the wastewater treatment plant. Then you have to take that and bring it somewhere else or use a different process to destroy it, which often is very costly or very energy intensive. And we're, again, getting better and coming up with new ways to do this. But absolutely a big part of this is cost. And water companies in the UK, for example, which are already strapped and dealing with a lot of issues and needing a lot of investment, are being asked to install these better treatments. But of course, it's really important that they do this. But they're saying that, it will cost a lot of money.
Yeah, and the bill might come to the consumer.
Right.
I mean, a sort of concluding question from me, and this is sort of to both of you in ways. I'll start with Leana. Leana, how convinced are you that people's lives are actually being ended or shortened by PFAS in the UK?
I think there's scientific evidence which says that PFAS contributes to lots of health risks.
And is that just near the places where there's a factory or something, or is that for all of us?
Well, Professor Philippe Grandjean says that at very low levels of PFAS, that leads to immunotoxicity. So when your immune system is, suppressed, you might not know that PFAS has contributed to your shorter lifespan.
You might not know. I'm guessing it hasn't appeared on a death certificate yet.
No.
Yeah, and Stephanie, what about you? I mean, how convinced are you that it's either ending people's lives or shortening them?
It's hard to pick out what is the cause. Is it PFAS or lead or another chemical contaminant or pollution in the air or a cocktail or a genetic thing, right? These are difficult questions that scientists are still working out how to figure out. But it does seem sensible to me to try to prevent those potential harmful things from happening if we can. And again, because it's something that takes a while to build up and see an effect, we need to start now to try to prevent the problem from happening in the first place.
Well, thank you very much to our guests, Stephanie Metzger from the Royal Society of Chemistry, Hannah Evans of environmental charity Fidra, journalist Leana Hosea, and attorney Robert Bilott.
There are a couple of things that came up in the end there that I think crystallised why this is such a difficult problem. It was referred to that it might cost trillions to put it right.
It's a big number.
And yet, neither of our contributors in the studio could actually say categorically that it was ending or shortening life. So you're asking people to potentially pay a huge bill on something that may well develop into a problem in the future. And that's difficult to ask, let alone industry. It's quite difficult to ask society to do that, isn't it?
But there's also a precautionary principle that says you could stop making it now if you don't really need it. And I think that's the thing that we almost didn't discuss is what is the, we heard about sort of reductions and maybe some labelling, but it seems like, yes, I'm sure there are essential uses. And of course, medical technology is the one that's always held up. But it does seem there's a lot of, I'm not sure whether frivolous uses is the right case, but you could stop those now quite easily and there wouldn't be a cost. And that seems like, before you start talking about the trillions, let's take the low-hanging fruit. Yeah. And that seems pretty important.
And there are quite a few products out there, frying pans, coats, cosmetics and things, which are free of these chemicals.
But the thing that I keep coming back to, in the problem is that this thing of there's a mechanism, because I'm interested in how things work, right? I'm not sure you should be producing it if you can't see a mechanism for it to be destroyed, even if it might have harmful consequences. That seems pretty irresponsible to me.
One of the other things that really intrigued me was in some ways environmentally, and this doesn't often happen, in a way, the US is a little bit ahead of the rest of the world. Clearly there's a lot of alarm there. Rob Bilott was suggesting that this kind of regulation might even be proof against the sort of, Hurricane Trump when it comes to getting rid of environmental regulation. So it's clearly, bitten in America.
Yeah, it's uncertain times over there, I think.
Just a quick thing before we leave. You asked me how I felt about the test that revealed I had PFAS in my body. What would you feel if you had the same test and got similar results?
I kind of accept that there's lots of small things, there's lots of probably things I'm carrying in my body that I wouldn't necessarily want to be there. And until they do me damage, it's not going to be real to me. And I think that's the difficult bit, isn't it?
Well, I hope you've enjoyed this edition of Rare Earth. It was produced by Alistair Cross in association with our friends at the Open University.
You can explore key environmental issues across the life cycle of everyday products with a new interactive guide from the university. Just head to the BBC Rare Earth homepage and follow the links to the Open University.
That sounds like a really interesting tool there. Well, next week we'll take to the 7 seas to find out how to take pollution out of the shipping industry. Should we return to the golden age of the Cutty Sark and move our freight by the power of wind and sail?
For years, a witness's evidence has been locked away.
I've seen the dark side.
He warned a chemical is coming.
It's a silent killer.
And that he was a target.
Forced into a witness protection program.
We're Dan Ashby and Lucy Taylor, two investigative journalists, joined by the Hollywood star Michael Sheen.
Do you think someone's going to try and kill us?
From BBC Radio 4, an unsettling investigation into a chemical secret unravels.
They don't have any record of him.
What?
Listen now to Bury the Last Witness on BBC Sounds.